Mr. Menon? Mr. Menon, good morning.
Thank you. This opening statement for Tranche 1, Phase 3 is made on behalf of Tariq Ali, Ernie, Tate, and Piers Corbyn in advance of the evidence to be given by Special Demonstration Squad managers covering the period from 1968 to 1982. It should be read in conjunction with our two earlier opening statements dated the 25th of October 2020 and the 16th of April 2021. Tariq Ali gave evidence during Tranche 1, Phase 1, the first non-state co-participant who was spied on by the police to do so, and Piers Corbyn gave evidence during Tranche 1, Phase 2. Ernie Tate was unable to give evidence in person for reasons of ill health, and his statement was read into evidence during Tranche 1, Phase 1. Sadly, Mr. Tate passed away in February 2021. We have tried to avoid, sir, as much as possible, any repetition today of the same points that we have previously made. For the avoidance of doubt, we remain deeply concerned, as I'm sure you appreciate, about excessive delay and secrecy. We adopt the submissions made about these and other general matters by the cooperating group of non-state co-participants and other non-state co-participants. As none of the non-state co-participants who we represent are giving evidence during this phase, we limit our remarks today to the following topics: the Tranche 1 Phase 4 closed hearings, the 7 SDS managers giving live evidence in the next few days, disclosure and redactions, the relationship between SDS and MI5, the development of SDS in the 1970s, and the future of the inquiry. Starting then with the closed hearings. There is, in our submission, something fundamentally wrong and unfair about a public inquiry into undercover policing, departing from the principle of open justice and conducting closed hearings, during which former undercover officers whose real names, cover names, and witness statements have all been withheld pursuant to restriction orders, give evidence with police lawyers present, but the non-state co-participants, their lawyers, and the public excluded. This is precisely what happened sometime in the autumn of 2021, when 5 undercover officers, HN 21, 41, 109, 302, and 341, were questioned by counsel to the inquiry in what are being called the Tranche 1 Phase 4 closed hearings. In the Tranche 1 Phase 3 hearing bundle, the inquiry has disclosed the redacted transcripts of the evidence in closed session of the 5 undercover officers and a 70-page document entitled Unattributable Excerpts from Closed Officer Evidence. According to paragraph 11 of counsel to the inquiry's second addendum disclosure note regarding Tranche 1, dated the 14th of April, 2022, around half of the total evidence received from these 5 officers has been published in the redacted transcripts and unattributable excerpts, which obviously means that around half of the total evidence has not been published and will remain secret forever. We have no idea why around half of what these 5 officers had to say in evidence during the closed hearings is being withheld, other than the inquiry asserting in its disclosure note that the evidence is subject to redaction for reasons of public interest. What does this mean, we ask? What public interest? Whose public interest? Certainly not the public interest of those we represent who were spied upon, learning the truth about the full nature and extent of the secret political policing of which they were victims. Furthermore, we're completely in the dark as to why the evidence in the unattributable excerpts, some of which is clearly relevant and significant and of interest, cannot be attributed. How in the circumstances are the non-state co-participants supposed to participate effectively and equally in at least this part of the inquiry in circumstances where the witness statements are withheld, the opportunity to ask questions is denied, and some of the evidence has not been attributed? On any sensible view we submit, closed hearings should have no place in a public inquiry into secret political policing, particularly when the evidence concerns events that took place 40 or more years ago? Why are anonymity and screens not sufficient safeguards? Furthermore, all evidence in a public inquiry should be attributed. How else can there be any accountability? How else can the evidence be put into context by the non-state core participants and understood in relation to the overall evidential picture? Turning then to the closed officer evidence itself, we find it incredible that HN21, an officer who was perfectly willing 20 years ago to speak openly about his undercover role in the BBC documentary True Lies, is unable to give evidence in open session. HN21 was a married officer who became a local organizer in the Socialist Workers' Party. He admits to a sexual relationship with a woman who he met in a Marxist study class, a woman who he disingenuously characterizes as apolitical, as if to distance himself from the inevitable accusation that he was sleeping with a political target. What is the relevance of the woman being apolitical? Does HN21 believe that the woman being apolitical somehow renders his violation of her more palatable? HN21 also observes the following. From the SWP side, it was mostly shouting. From the far right thing, it was mostly physical violence. Yet we will learn during the Tranche 1 Phase 3 evidential hearings that there was apparently a high-level policy decision not to use SDS to infiltrate the far right. Now, given HN21's cogent observation, why did SDS target the left and not the right? We trust this will be explored in more depth during the live evidence. HN41, another of the five officers, was an SDS officer in the 1970s and 1980s. He is of great importance to what happened at Southall on the 23rd of April, 1979, when Blair Peach was killed by a police officer and Tariq Ali and many others were severely beaten by police officers. HN41 says that he was warned by senior special branch officers not to go to Southall with his target group because the uniformed police were going to clamp down on the demonstrations, and management considered the dangers were more than normal. Two important points arise. Firstly, in the transcript of HN41's evidence in closed session, all the names of the target groups that he infiltrated have been redacted. Why? Why are the names of groups which were infiltrated by him some 43 years ago so sensitive that they cannot be publicly revealed, even now? Secondly, and this is particularly important, this is the first time we've had a police witness acknowledge openly the true nature of public order pre-planning by the uniformed A8 branch, the special operational unit that had been set up after the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign demonstration against the Vietnam War in March 1968. Given HN41's evidence and given what we now know about the violence meted out by the uniformed police on the 23rd of April 1979 against anti-fascists demonstrating against the National Front marching through Southall, can there really be any doubt that the uniformed police, particularly the notorious Special Patrol Group, a mobile unit under the direct control of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir David McNee, were under secret orders to use violence against anti-fascist demonstrators? Far from SDS providing intelligence to A8 to allow the latter to plan and steward a peaceful demonstration, the effect of the SDS intelligence reports was merely to heighten the view within the police as a whole that all anti-fascist demonstrators were subversives and fair game for police truncheons. This explains HN41's plaintive comment that A8 weren't perhaps as receptive to some of our ideas as we thought they might have been. While HN41 rightly castigates A8 for their disastrous mistake to shut down a part of Southall, he still, to this day, fails to understand the mentality of the senior police hierarchy, who saw left-wing protesters as subversives, as the enemy within. Indeed, as HN41 himself says, The security service saw left-wing protesters as potential fifth columnists, echoing the language of the Second World War. This is, we submit, the proper context in which the killing of Blair Peach, the severe beating of Tariq Ali and many others by police officers, and the subsequent institutional cover-up by the police must be considered. It is no surprise that the Special Branch report into the killing of Blair Peach has mysteriously gone missing, despite Special Branch having its own archives. It has either been buried or destroyed. There are questions that we would have wanted to ask HN 41 on behalf of Tariq Ali, given the 11-page redacted transcript of his evidence in closed session that has been disclosed. This leaves a lingering sense of injustice about an opportunity wasted and represents the inevitable cost of having closed hearings from which the non-state court participants and their lawyers are excluded. Now, before we leave the topic of the closed hearings, we want to add one other point that was highlighted by another officer, HN 109, who was undercover in the 1970s and a manager in the 1980s. He says that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner visited the SDS safe house annually, as did other senior officers. Additionally, he mentions SDS receiving congratulations on more than one occasion from 10 Downing Street for its supposed success in combating public disorder, commenting that he was stunned that somebody at that level could have an awareness of this secret unit. As we said in our first opening statement, sir, SDS was a unit that was thoroughly integrated into the security apparatus of the British state and was known to all leading state actors, from the Prime Minister to the Cabinet to the Home Office and down the chain of command within the Security Service and the Metropolitan Police Service. In respect of the supposed success of SDS in combating public disorder and its provision of useful intelligence to A8, all of which happens to have gone missing, we say nothing could be further from the truth, unless success is being measured by the degree of chaos caused by the police on the streets of London. Starting with the October 1968 VSC demonstration against the Vietnam War, this was a peaceful demonstration, not because of any intelligence from SDS, but because it was well stewarded by the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. The small breakaway demonstration was entirely foreseeable from routine intelligence and was effectively policed by uniformed officers using a thick static cordon. Undercover policing did not make a blind bit of difference to the absence of any serious violence on the day. The Special Operations Squad, as SDS was then called, should have been shut down after this demonstration, but it wasn't. At many of the large demonstrations of the 1970s, the police invariably failed to keep the peace, notwithstanding SDS intelligence. We suspect this was because the left-wing and anarchist groups being spied on and infiltrated by the undercover officers posed little real public order threat. SDS should have been focused, but were not, on the far right, who were the real public order threat. Furthermore, there is abundant evidence in the public domain that the uniformed police were at times looking for confrontation, and not just the uniformed officers, but those most senior too. In June 1974, whilst the police were protecting a National Front meeting in Red Lion Square, Kevin Gately, an anti-fascist student, was killed. In June 1977, the police used violence against striking Grunwick workers and their supporters at a mass picket. In August 1977, the Home Secretary and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner allowed the National Front to march through Lewisham, a multiracial community, with their racist banners and slogans. When confronted by an anti-fascist counter-protest, the police brought out riot shields for the first time on the British mainland, and baton charges and mounted police were used against the crowd. The Battle of Lewisham, as it came to be called, ended in chaos. And we've already highlighted the police killing of Blair Peach and the police attack on many other anti-fascists in Southall in April 1979, who were peacefully demonstrating against another provocative National Front march through a multiracial community. Are Red Lion Square, Grunwick, Lewisham, and Southall supposed to be police successes? If so, perhaps this gives the measure of what the police were trying to achieve at the time. I turn now to the evidence that you're about to hear in the next few days. Live evidence to be given by former SDS managers or administrators, namely Barry Moss, David Smith, Roy Creamer, Derek Bryce, Jeffrey Croft, Angus McIntosh, and Trevor Butler. Other non-state co-participants.
I think it appears to have gone slightly wrong with the transmission. Let's pause while it's put right.
Yes, I think somebody's not muted.
Yeah. Try again, and if we get the same interruption, then by all means pause.
Thank you. I just identified the 7 witnesses who are going to be giving evidence in the hearings to follow the opening statements. Other non-state co-participants have already highlighted the contradiction between senior officers on the one hand claiming that they robustly managed rank and file undercover officers, and on the other hand professing ignorance about abhorrent practices that occurred on their watch. We trust that this will be fully explored during the evidential hearings and that the senior officers will be held to account for their managerial failings. On a separate note, we are pleased that the inquiry has decided to call former Detective Inspector Roy Creamer, an SDS officer who was described by Stuart Christie, perhaps Britain's best-known anarchist, who sadly passed away in 2020, as the Yard's dialectician of dissent. Detective Inspector Creamer was one of the first in the queue at Collett's bookshop in Charing Cross Road to buy a copy of Stuart Christie and Albert Meltzer's seminal book, The Floodgates of Anarchy, when it was first published in 1970, and was, in Stuart Christie's words, the acknowledged special branch expert on anarchists and anarchism, who was called in to brief everyone from the Home Secretary and the Police Commissioner downwards. Detective Inspector Creamer, said Stuart Christie, did not dislike anarchists, but was curious as to what made them tick. He was the epitome of what we might call the direct approach, as opposed to the oblique approach developed by Detective Chief Inspector Conrad Dixon and the Special Demonstration Squad. Detective Inspector Creamer tried to establish friendly and sympathetic relationships with people targeted by Special Branch, and to this end would regularly pop in unannounced to an antiques shop in Camden High Street to play chess with the old Hungarian anarchist John Retty. Detective Inspector Creamer would visit Stuart Christie and over a pint chat about forthcoming events or visits, effectively marking his card with a gentle warning as to the fact that Special Branch had him under surveillance. We suggest that the direct approach, as exemplified by Detective Inspector Creamer, was a proportionate approach to the gathering of intelligence. By contrast, the oblique approach to sweep wide, using Detective Chief Inspector Dixon's parlance, was replete with obvious dangers. In any event, the gathering of intelligence for public order purposes could largely be done from open source intelligence, monitoring the left-wing and anarchist press, attending public meetings, and speaking to people. I return now, sir, to the vexed topic of disclosure and redactions that has plagued the inquiry from the outset. In June 2021, you will recall, we took the lead and made detailed submissions on what we submitted was the unfairness of the inquiry's protocol dated the 22nd of July 2020 for challenging the inquiry's redactions. We addressed the open grounds for restriction and asked you to reconsider several hundred redactions in the SDS annual reports from 1969 to 1984. We highlighted the very real and chilling effect of continuing to keep secret the names of so many groups who were spied on and infiltrated by the SDS some 40 or more years ago. We called for greater openness and transparency given the machinations of the secret state. And we met with some, but sadly only minimal success. You unredacted the names of about 10 groups that were spied on and infiltrated by the SDS, but not the full list that we requested. We ask with respect that at least once a year for the duration of this inquiry, there is a further fresh review of all SDS annual report redactions, and that before the inquiry eventually comes to an end, there is a final review. Most restrictions have clearly been made to protect the anonymity of former undercover officers. It may well be that some or all these restrictions may no longer be applicable or necessary in the future. It is hoped that before the inquiry papers go into the National Archives, the names of all groups spied on and infiltrated by SDS can be disclosed to the general public. And we ask for a similar approach to be taken in respect of the Special Branch annual reports from 1970 to 1983 and any further reports in future tranches which have been disclosed during this hearing bundle. Finally, we still await the Security Service annual threat assessments. It's a point we keep on raising. We submit they're plainly relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference. I turn now to the relationship between SDS and MI5. This is a key issue that continues to develop as we learn more and more from the evidence about the relationship. Several special branch detectives who were involved in what was called the Special Operations Squad in 1968 expected the squad to be wound up after the October 1968 Vietnam Solidarity Campaign demonstration, the job having been done, so to speak. But the senior Metropolitan Police hierarchy, and more importantly, MI5, wanted the squad to become permanent. The police, with a brief to keep the peace, could only justify the continued existence of the squad on one ground, namely success in the field of public order intelligence. However, MI5 immediately recognized the value of this squad as a long-term intelligence gathering operation against all those it deemed subversive. Given MI5's wide interpretation of the term subversive, it could literally apply to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of British citizens, all of whom would then become subject to MI5 vetting procedures. In 1968, with the rise of what has come to be called the New Left, the operations of MI5 and Special Branch, which targeted the trade unions and the Communist Party of Great Britain primarily, appeared somewhat outdated. There was a realization that the secret state had not paid sufficient attention to these new groups. MI5 were overjoyed when Detective Chief Inspector Dixon came up with the idea of a squad of Special Branch officers spying on and infiltrating these groups. They could hardly contain their enthusiasm for the squad continuing, so long as the product of the undercover officers was provided to them as a matter of routine. Consequently, for MI5, SDS served only one purpose: to gather intelligence on the New Left and anarchists. They had no interest in public order, except insofar as it was a fig leaf to cover up the obvious role of SDS as intelligence gatherers for MI5. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that the purse strings were firmly in the hands of the Home Office and the Treasury. It is significant that SDS were not funded within the MPS Metropolitan Police budget. It should be noted that Sir James Waddell, who received the SDS annual reports, was Cabinet Secretary responsible for liaison with MI5. In our view, MI5 were the organ grinders and SDS were the monkeys. Only the monkeys did not know to whose tune they were really dancing. Even Geoffrey Kraft, who became Chief Superintendent of F Squad in about 1981, with responsibility for SDS, says that the branch were the legs of the security service. SDS was only a development of that. Trevor Butler says that there were frequent meetings between MI5 and Special Branch senior management. Interestingly, and I'm sure you have noted this already, sir, many of the SDS managers deny any involvement in tasking and say this came from higher up. It did. It came from MI5 through to the Special Branch Commander of Operations or Chief Superintendent, and was then filtered down. The detective chief inspectors and detective inspectors in the office would then look at their current deployments and move undercover officers around or deploy new undercover officers. That is why it was useful for undercover officers to float around a little and sweep wide, as this allowed them to be more effectively moved if need be. As MI5 were interested in individuals and not groups, their requests of SDS were specific. Geoffrey Kraft says that SDS gave MI5 a huge base of information for their vetting activity. It's interesting that Special Branch had their own security concerns about MI5 knowing the names of FDS officers, because they were worried, understandably perhaps, that MI5 informers in the same groups could discover their identities and compromise them. We asked the inquiry once again to revisit its decision only to consider MI5 in respect of its interaction with SDS as revealed by the documents. Allowing MI5 largely to escape scrutiny will inevitably result, sir, in at best a partial picture of secret political policing in Britain. I turn next to the development of SDS in the 1970s. It was in 1972, the year that Conrad Dixon became Chief Superintendent of C Squad, that the Metropolitan Police changed the name of the Special Operations Squad to the Special Demonstration Squad, to give further cover to the idea that the squad was about demonstrations in public order. Once again, this was plausible deniability, we submit, to cover up what the SDS really was, an intelligence gathering operation of those deemed subversive. We have no C Squad weekly reports to A8 throughout this whole period dealing with public order threats. We will see if they are forthcoming for future years. David Smith, one of the witnesses you're going to hear from, says that he does not recall A8 ever saying thank you, and that they largely ignored any intelligence supplied. We suggest this is entirely accurate and unsurprising. In around 1979, David Smith wrote a 12-page essay on policing, crowd control, and public disorder. This, you may agree, is an interesting document. In his opinion, the risk of violence on demonstrations is greatest some 5 to 7 days after an emotive initiating event. He says that only rarely do the extremists formulate their plans in total secrecy, and normally, albeit grudgingly, they will supply to police the broad outline of their intentions. He suggests that large demonstrations tended to be more moderate and peaceful, as there was a dilution of more militant elements, while small protests could be handled by the uniformed branch relatively easily. The problem often arose with militant protests, he says, of about 2,000 demonstrators turning violent. What use, we say then, was SDS in combating public disorder? Ultimately, however, even David Smith, despite that analysis, cannot detach him from the mantra that undercover officers profoundly influenced the Metropolitan Police's ability to maintain public order. We profoundly disagree. It will hardly surprise you that we say all evidence points to the contrary. Lastly, in relation to public order, we suggest that when the authorities allow a far-right group like the National Front, with its overtly racist and fascist membership, to march through an urban area with a large ethnic minority community, as the police did in Lewisham in 1977 and Southall in 1979, and when the police then protect the fascists and deploy all their resources against the anti-fascist counter-demonstrators, it is fairly obvious that there will be trouble. You don't need the SDS to tell you that. According to Angus McIntosh, who was posted to SDS between 1976 and 1979, although SDS were ready to infiltrate extreme right-wing groups if needed, there was a high-level policy decision during his time in SDS not to allow or order such infiltration. We know that E Squad was meant to monitor such groups, but the far right was never subject to anything resembling the degree of intrusive surveillance and infiltration to which the left and anarchist groups were subject, despite the fact that racists and fascists were well known to all, including the police, for their violence and were in reality the real public order threat. This further suggests, we submit, that the primary focus of SDS was gathering intelligence on groups and individuals of a left-wing or anarchist persuasion, as opposed to preventing public disorder. The political persuasions, and this is important, of many senior police officers, many of an ex-service background, were very much on the right of the political spectrum, as is clear from their witness statements. For example, the comments of Jeffrey Kraft about mob rule, lefties, scruffy, hairy so-and-sos, they speak for themselves. This is classic Reds under the bed stuff with a dose of McCarthyism thrown in for good measure. The final justification for the SDS, negative reporting. Simply put, It means that if SDS discovers that a group poses no threat to public order, this is nevertheless useful and of benefit to the police. But surely this begs the obvious question as to why the group needed to be infiltrated in the first place. We say this is scraping the barrel of disingenuous ex post facto justification. Turning then finally, sir, to the future of the inquiry. We understand that the Tranche 2 hearings covering the period from 1983 to 1992 are unlikely to commence before the spring of 2024, and that subsequent hearings covering spying in the 1990s and 2000s will take place in the months and years thereafter. We ask rhetorically, and I'm sure you understand why, how many more undercover officers, non-state core participants, and other relevant witnesses will have passed away or have become unavailable to participate in the inquiry for reasons of ill health by then is anyone's guess. We appreciate, of course, that the material being processed by the inquiry is voluminous and that the state core participants are insisting that every word on every page is potentially subject to restriction and redaction. These things take time, we get it. However, the inquiry at present has no end in sight. And this is obviously a matter of great concern and disappointment to the non-state core participants. But on a more positive note, and I think it is important to say this, we welcome the indication that you've given in the last few days that the legal framework for the conduct of undercover police operations must be determined and cannot be shirked, to use your words. Finally, sir, I know I'm more or less at the end of my time. If I could be forgiven just to say a few words on behalf of 3 other non-state core participants who I represent, 2 of whom were targeted in the 1970s, and I'll be very brief, namely Ken Livingstone, the Friends of Freedom Press, and Dwayne Brooks. You know, sir, that it's clear from the material disclosed thus far that Ken Livingstone, in relation to Ken Livingstone, that the secret state began spying on him in the 1970s. Nevertheless, his name only features in a handful of intelligence reports disclosed thus far. And we say that's odd for 2 reasons, primarily. Firstly, Mr. Livingstone, as you know, was active on multiple fronts during the 1970s, notably on the left of the Labour Party, but also on Ireland and on anti-racism. Secondly, after being elected leader of the Greater London Council in May 1981, which is within our period of time, he was denounced by the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, as wanting to impose upon the nation a tyranny which the peoples of Eastern Europe yearned to cast aside, and by the right-wing press as Red Ken and a left-wing extremist. And so we say it's inconceivable that he did not become a prime target of the secret state, at that stage at least. So why is there such a paucity of material on him? We know that some of the campaigns he supported, like the Troops Out movement, were infiltrated. Does the tiny number of SDS reports on him suggest that he wasn't being spied on by the SDS? Was it MI5 who was spying on him? What role did SDS play? What was the nature of the spying? Surely, we asked, one or more of the managers who you're going to hear from in the next few days may be able to give cogent evidence and shed some light on these important questions. Freedom Press, including the Freedom Collective, was also an SDS target in the 1970s. The Freedom Collective is mentioned as a target for the first time in the 1974 SDS annual report. And Roger Piers, who you will know this, of course, went on to become head of SDS and later head of Special Branch. He was spying on the Freedom Collective between 1978 and 1984, using the cover name of Roger Thorley and writing articles for its paper. Again, we ask, why is there such a paucity of material on Freedom Press and the Freedom Collective? Where are Roger Pierce's SDS reports? And finally, Dwayne Brooks. And I mention him for one reason only, because obviously he features in much later tranches. Barry Moss, an SDS manager in the 1980s, who later became a commander in Special Branch in the 1990s, is your first police witness this Friday. He gave evidence to Mark Ellison's 2014 review into corruption and undercover policing in the Stephen Lawrence case. He doesn't address this in the witness statement that the inquiry has thus far taken. And all we are urging the inquiry to do, we're not suggesting that he can be asked any questions about this because his statement doesn't cover it. We understand that. But we do urge the inquiry to take a further witness statement from him as soon as possible, given his age, a statement that covers his knowledge about undercover policing on Mr. Brooks and the Lawrence family. My apologies, sir, for going slightly over. Those are my submissions for Tranche 1, Phase 3.
Thank you very much. I don't propose to enter into a public debate with you about your statement and propositions, but can I offer some reassurance about Roger Pierce's reports? They are going to be dealt with in Tranche 2. They have been collated. They will be disclosed.
I'm grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I resume in approximately 10 minutes' time. Mr. Morris.
Thank you. I speak as a core participant in this inquiry and one who was targeted by police spies from the mid-1970s onwards, both personally and as a member of targeted political and campaigning groups. I have already contributed to the inquiry a witness statement and 2 detailed opening statements for previous hearings. I have slightly amended and expanded on my written statement submitted in April. On Monday, you, as the chair of the inquiry, indicated you had welcomed Tariq Ali when he gave evidence in 2020 in helpfully explaining Trotskyist ideas to you. In the light of police misconceptions about anarchists, in various disclosed documents, including annual reports, I will try to explain the predominant motivations, aims and activities of anarchists and the anarchist movement as I see it. Standing up for the public interest against the rich and powerful. As already outlined in my previous statements, I have been involved since 1974 in a range of groups and campaigns trying to encourage the public to support one another and empower themselves where they live and work to challenge injustice, oppression and damage to the environment, and to make the world a better place for everyone. The various groups I've been involved in over the decades have been open and collectively run and engaged in the kind of public activities which the public are invited to join in or to replicate for themselves, and which are essential if humanity is to progress and survive in the future. Such groups, as we all should, question and challenge those institutions which wield power over people's lives and control the world's resources and decision-making. These include governments, transnational corporations, military organisations and financial institutions. Such powerful institutions are generally tightly controlled by a small, self-serving elite continually obsessed with power and profit and are ruthless and unaccountable. In fact, as I outlined in more detail in my April 2021 statement, they are subversive of society and people's real needs. They are the real subversives that need to be investigated. Indeed, they are also the inevitable cause of most of what the SDS would define as, quote, public disorder in response to injustice. Unsurprisingly, such institutions have made a shocking mess of the world for centuries, causing mass hardship and poverty, disempowerment, discrimination and oppression, exploitation of workers and resources, horrific wars, and large-scale environmental destruction. They have brought humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation and have been systematically exploiting and destroying the natural environment upon which human society depends for our survival. As a result, our species now faces a catastrophic and possibly terminal future. Many of the groups I have been involved with believe that the evidence of history demonstrates that such aforementioned institutions can't be successfully reformed and turned into benevolent, useful public bodies. However, history also demonstrates that grassroots movements for change, if large enough and determined enough, can shift the balance of power and win concessions and victories for the public along the way. The groups I have been involved in have tried their best to support efforts to build single issue and other campaigns and movements to improve things in the here and now. Some of those groups logically also call for the hierarchical and authoritarian institutions which are causing the shocking problems humanity unfortunately has to face to be replaced in the long term by a genuinely democratic way of running society, one in which people all over the world collectively manage their own neighbourhoods, workplaces and lives, and ensure that all the resources are shared fairly and all decision-making is for the public good. This is libertarian socialism or anarchism. On Monday, you requested suggestions for key relevant reading materials, hence I recommend the following books. On Anarchism by Noam Chomsky. Anarchism, a very short introduction by Colin Ward. And Demanding the Impossible, a history of anarchism by Peter Marshall. If you enjoy science fiction, I also recommend The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. I am proud of the many groups and campaigns I have been involved in and believe that such efforts should be supported, not undermined. Similar to points made by other non-state core participants in this week's opening statements, as an active anarchist in the Tranche 1 period, I do not recognise the ignorant, derogatory and misleading SDS and special branch annual reports, official characterisations about the ideals and activities of anarchists during that period. The evidence of undercover officer Graham Coates, as the only undercover officer spying on anarchists we have relevant evidence from at this stage, as far as I am aware, amply demonstrates the reality. For 2 years or more, he personally targeted me and the groups I was involved with, especially the Anarchy magazine collective, and concluded, quote, "The anarchists I reported on posed a minimal challenge to public order. I do not think either the International Socialists or the anarchist movement was subversive in terms of their actions. I do not believe any info I provided was particularly significant. I do not think it would have made any difference to public order if I had not worked for the SDS." Anarchist groups, just like pretty much all of the left-wing and campaign groups targeted, were full of well-meaning and idealistic people with a sense of justice, engaged in spreading progressive ideas for a better society. They were helping run newspapers, bookshops, and other cooperative projects, taking part in open or public meetings and social and cultural events, encouraging people to think and speak up for themselves and support each other and their needs where they live and work, and encouraging people to empower themselves to be in control of their lives rather than just be loyal subjects, passive consumers, and forced to obey those with power over them. For example, landlords, employers, politicians, and police. They were participating in a range of essential protests on the issues of the time and constructively supporting movements against injustice and inequality and for positive change. Yet, the biased and self-serving official annual reports, extracts of which were quoted so eruditely by the counsel to the inquiry in his opening statement on Monday, deliberately failed to acknowledge and outline these basic facts. If they had have done, they would have had to have admitted that their infiltration operations were indeed totally unacceptable. SDS targeting in the 1970s and further important evidence awaited. In the Tranche 1 period, the main groups I was involved in included the London Workers Group, which supported workers challenging exploitation at work, the Union of Postal Workers and Rank and File Post Office Worker magazine, which were fellow postal workers to myself supporting each other, Anarchy magazine, spreading anti-authoritarian ideas and news, and the Persons Unknown support group, a campaign in defence of activists arrested, found at trial to be not guilty. And finally, the Torness Alliance, opposition to the development of nuclear energy. I've already referred to Anarchy magazine. The London Workers Group was infiltrated by undercover officer Tony Williams, who was a spy from 1978 to 1982. His statement has so far been withheld from me, as for some reason he has been allocated to Tranche 2. It is therefore impossible to comment or ask questions of his managers about the extent of this unlawful and disgusting infiltration of what was an open group, and about the other groups he targeted. However, we know from two of the disclosed documents that he became firstly the treasurer of the London Workers Group and then the secretary, giving him full access to personal information on the group's supporters, no doubt to be passed on to MI5 for blacklisting purposes. Interestingly, another document from MI5, dated 30th of July 1982, states that when Tony Williams was due to be withdrawn from the SDS in 1982, the MI5 F6 manager had met with HN68 from the SDS, who considered it was, quote, no great loss, as Tony Williams' work had not been particularly productive. I have given the inquiry a photo I took of Tony Williams in 1980. Regarding the Torness Alliance, this was a UK-wide campaign to oppose the building of a new nuclear power station in Scotland. The main objections were firstly the threat of catastrophic nuclear accidents, as had almost happened in 1979 at 3 Mile Island in the US, and in 1986 actually happened at Chernobyl in Ukraine, resulting subsequently in an estimated 9,000 to 16,000 deaths from air pollution throughout Europe. Second concern was the lack of safe disposal of nuclear waste, which would be dangerously radioactive for thousands of years. 10,000 people protested at Torness in 1979, and there were some follow-up protests in the year afterwards. I was involved in this campaign. London Greenpeace were heavily involved in this movement, and I later got involved with that group around 1982. London Greenpeace was infiltrated by the SDS for many years, as we will come to in Tranche 2. According to their witness statements for T1P3, a number of SDS undercover officers were infiltrating the anti-nuclear movement, and at least 4 managers visited the Torness site. However, we are unfortunately expecting most of the evidence and documentation relevant to this movement and London Greenpeace to not be disclosed until Tranche 2. The 1979 Special Branch Annual Report is disclosed in full and contains a huge wealth of evidence about or relevant to the SDS and its spying operation. It includes 3 explicit references to myself in the monthly sections and many other references to groups and events I was involved with a month-by-month chronology and very helpful index cross-referencing the names of over 200 targeted groups and over 100 targeted individuals in that year alone. The other Special Branch Annual Reports disclosed by the inquiry have been massively cut. They are thin and vague in comparison. The full reports for all the relevant years, including for the forthcoming tranches, should be disclosed as soon as possible. This will help identify many of the list of 1,000 groups, of the 1,000 groups targeted by the SDS, for which we have been waiting for years. Due to the many delays during the inquiry and the further delays expected, all the witness statements already taken from undercover officers should be disclosed as soon as possible. This is essential so that core participants can begin to prepare their responses, including seeking out others from groups and events affected by the spying operation over the life of the SDS and later the NPIOU, rather than having to wait for years until the last minute when it is generally too late to trace victims and prepare evidence effectively. A key question for managers. Why did the police never consider the welfare as well as the human and legal rights of those members of the public they targeted, the victims? Surely they had a duty of care whilst invading and influencing people's lives. Surely any normal human being would do so anyway, duty of care or not. After 7 years of the inquiry, many thousands of people in groups targeted, whether those groups have already been revealed or so far are still concealed, remain in the dark about who spied on them, what information was collected, and what was done with it. They are understandably angry, as well as being confused and suspicious about which individuals from their past may have been police spies and events from their life which may have been secretly invaded and manipulated by state agents, cynically masquerading as their friends and colleagues. This delay is unacceptable and we need the full truth. In contrast, the inquiry at the behest of the police is strongly applying privacy and human rights concerns to protect the identity and welfare of undercover officers. This sudden police conversion to such rights, not previously of any concern of their secret units during their 4 or 5 decades of operations, is surely staggering hypocrisy. It would be seen as ironic if it wasn't so serious. Many might think that those who secretly invaded and abused people's lives should have vacated their own privacy rights. Furthermore, in most core participants' opinion, the current privacy strategy of the police and inquiry is the key cause of the massive problems, costs, and delays in the inquiry. The public would expect that such privacy protection criteria applied to the undercover officers be applied 100 times more strongly when evaluating the unlawfulness of the SDS and the rights of those victims who are seeking a better society, who are thereby secretly targeted, lied to, abused, manipulated, and reported on to the police and secret services. Conclusion. I have read and support the impressive, detailed opening statements made on behalf of the Category H core participants and on behalf of the cooperating group of core participants, and indeed those for the other non-state core participants. These statements clearly demonstrate beyond doubt that the entire secret SDS operation was unacceptable and unlawful, as well as being worthless. It demonstrates that the police were institutionally anti-democratic, as well as being institutionally sexist, racist, and anti-working class. The infiltration of left-wing and progressive groups and campaigns and the invasion of their members' lives should never have been allowed to happen. Managers and those higher up the chain, all the way to police chiefs and government ministers, must apologise and be held responsible and accountable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I ask just one question of you? You have taken up the implied invitation to suggest a reading list to me. If I have time for any one of your factual books, which should it be?
Well, I would actually recommend the Demanding the Impossible by Peter Marshall. However, it's a weighty tome, so you may need to select which chapters that you would prefer to to engage with.
But that's the one you recommend. So I don't mind reading weighty tones. I'm quite happy with that. But 3 on the same topic may be too much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you very much. We will adjourn now for about a quarter of an hour, perhaps a little longer. I don't know the precise timings. Thank you. Ms. Heaven.
Morning, sir. Thank you. Are we ready to start, sir?
Please do. Forgive me. I didn't think I needed formally to invite you to make your opening statement, but please do.
So this opening statement is made on behalf of all the cooperating non-police, non-state core participants, which I will refer to as the non-state cooperating group. It supplements the statements that have been made directly on behalf of individuals and groups by their instructed lawyers, and the first and second opening statements made by the non-state cooperating group at the start of the evidence in Tranche 1, Phase 1 and Tranche 1, Phase 2. The non-state cooperating group once again expressed their concern in relation to the significant delay to the progress of this public inquiry. There has been a gap of 12 months since the T1, P2 hearings, and the non-state cooperating group understand that Tranche 2 will not take place before 2024. The inquiry has still not set out a clear timetable for all future hearings. The undercover police officers are of advancing age, and this is particularly so in relation to the managers who are to be heard in Tranche 1, Phase 3, some of whom will also have evidence to give in later tranches. Further delay will result in crucial evidence being lost. The non-state cooperating group deserve clarity on the future progression of this inquiry, and so demand that the inquiry publishes a timetable for all future hearings as a matter of urgency. I will now make some comments on the evidence on behalf of the non-state cooperating group. As the inquiry moves into T1P3, the period 1968 to 1982, it will focus on the activities of the managers and administrators from the Special Demonstration Squad. In T1P2, the inquiry heard truly shocking evidence about undercover officers operating an unjustifiable, unlawful, and profoundly anti-democratic system of surveillance that was fundamentally flawed. We've had a glimpse into a system that obviously violated fundamental rights and the common law, as has been set out in detail in the Category H T1P3 opening statement. The managers are now in the spotlight. The witness statement disclosed in this inquiry contain a litany of denials and an apparent unwillingness to accept responsibility or admit knowledge on key decision-making and events. The managers appear reluctant to give a full and honest explanation of why things went so badly wrong within the SDS in this T1 era and beyond. Why on earth, in 2022, would witnesses to this public inquiry not be willing to tell the full, unvarnished truth, the non-state cooperating group ask? Are the managers seeking to protect their professional reputation, or do they feel a sense of misguided loyalty to the Metropolitan Police Service, reinforced by their decades of experience of not breaking rank and protecting the institution at all costs? If this is the case, it is a deeply misplaced sentiment. As the witnesses in T1 P3 will no doubt be aware, the last 12 months have seen the public once again demanding answers from the MPS following the exposure of appalling acts of racism, misogyny, and corruption. This is an institution which has been found to be institutionally racist, institutionally corrupt, and marred by a culture of toxic masculinity, misogyny, and sexual harassment. The public and the non-state cooperating group are still demanding and expecting answers. The group can see from the T1, P2 and P3 disclosure that the SDS managers always emphasised their robust management of undercover officers when seeking a renewal of funding from the Home Office. If this is correct, the managers, as former senior police officers appointed to serve the public, have a duty to explain in a full and honest manner why it was that abhorrent practices went on under their watch. These practices echo the behaviour exposed in the MPS in the last 12 months. Why was it that managers presided over an unlawful system of policing that so obviously violated fundamental rights? Did the managers conceal these practices from their political masters? Or was it, as the non-state cooperating groups suspect, that the cover-up went on at the highest political level? It is therefore central to the inquiry's remit to obtain an understanding of the political knowledge of the SDS and the extent to which direction and targeting came from outside the SDS. There is a wealth of evidence demonstrating that senior Home Office officials knew about the SDS. After all, they approved the funding and often acted as the communications link between the security services and the Home Office. However, the early decision to allow the SDS to continue to operate would clearly not have been theirs alone. These were political decisions. This inquiry must establish who in the senior political hierarchy was controlling and directing SDS targeting, and who, beyond the Home Office civil servants, ultimately signed off the funding for the SDS and for what purpose. What motivated the alliances formed by the SDS with its, quote, customers? And why, for example, did the funding for the SDS increase rapidly during this era, at a time when public disorder was on the wane? The inquiry should not forget the admission by witness said, on behalf of the security services, that the pressure to investigate so-called subversive organisations, quote, often came from the Prime Minister and Whitehall. So I now want to make a few brief comments about terms of reference, regulation and the impact of secrecy. Uncovering the true nature of the shadowy political oversight of the SDS by the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, the Home Office and the security services is crucial. The evidence disclosed in Tranche 1 reveals that the Home Office knew at the time that SDS activities, for example for the security services, were unlawful. They also knew that if the SDS were exposed, it would result in a political scandal and significant embarrassment. As a result, from the outset, the political elite and senior Metropolitan Police Special Branch police officers deliberately shrouded the SDS in secrecy and did everything they could to insulate it from external oversight. Undercover operations were conducted without clear guidance and robust terms of reference, and there was no code of conduct or formal training. It was this secrecy that allowed the SDS managers in T1 to operate with such apparent complacency. And ultimately, it was this secrecy that allowed the abhorrent and unlawful practices of the undercover officers to flourish and thrive in the T1 era and beyond. In terms of guidance to the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, and in particular the SDS, between 1969 and 1982, we can see that the only official high-level instructions were to be found in the 1969 Responsibilities of Special Branch and the 1970 Home Office Terms of Reference for Special Branch. However, the 1970 Terms of Reference was known by the Home Office and the MPS to be a woefully inadequate and vague document with a problematic definition of subversion and no clear role assigned to the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. The 1972 definition of subversion did not contain the reference to unlawful activity that featured in Lord Denning's 1969 definition. And this has been set out in much more detail in the T1P3 opening statement made on behalf of Lindsay Germain, Richard Chesham and Mary. The Metropolitan Police Service 1970 terms of reference never contained that reference to unlawful. And in 1978, Robin Cook MP commented in Parliament on the 1972 amendment stating, quote, Lord Harris's definition of subversion does not turn on any reference to unlawful. It is in no way restricted to unlawful activities. It is therefore an invitation to the police forces that police this concept of subversion to stick their nose into any form of political or industrial activity. In the latest T1P3 disclosure, there is a clear paper trail which shows that as early as 1974, concerns were being raised at the highest political levels about the politicisation of the police and the illegitimate surveillance activities of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. Members of Parliament actively raised concerns with the Home Secretary and demanded better public scrutiny of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch covert surveillance activities. However, these MPs appeared to know nothing about the activities of the SDS. The paper trail then continues. The Robin Cook MP debates of 1977 to 78 forced the Home Office to begin the slow process of revising the terms of reference. As part of this process, Her Majesty's Chief Inspectorate of Constabulary raised concerns to the Home Office that, quote, the Security Service sought more information from Special Branch, says, than they really needed. The Home Office also knew that some senior police officers in the MPS had been questioning whether there was any lawful justification for their work for the security services. As early as 1974, Commander Gilbert told the security services that, quote, the SDS did a tremendous amount of work for the security services and that for the most part, the work done had little or no relevance to Special Branch's proper charter. And as far as he was concerned, it tied up staff, of which he was chronically short anyway, in totally unproductive activity. Now, so you will recall that some officers in T1P2, such as HM126 Paul Gray, spent significant amounts of his time reporting the intimate personal details of school children. It now appears this information was most likely collected for the security services, who in 1975 specifically asked the Metropolitan Police Special Branch to look out for extensive data on school children, teachers, and members of governing bodies promoting subversion. It seems that Commander Gilbert's concerns were not heeded by the policing and security establishment. The lengths to which the SDS would go to conduct unlawful surveillance work for the security services is typified by their targeting of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. The WRP was a political party that sought to bring about radical economic reform. It stood candidates in the 1974 general election, and the inquiry has been provided with that manifesto. The WRP was well recognised by the SDS as not using violence and not a threat to public order. It was clearly not a subversive organisation. However, it was nevertheless targeted by HN298 Mike Scott, who attended the WRP Education Centre, White Meadows, contrary to the wishes of DAC Gilbert. Despite the lack of public order threat and lawful activity, the SDS were nonetheless prepared to continue to target the WRP on behalf of the security services. And we can see in 1979 that DCI Mike Ferguson, who was then a senior SDS officer, stated in response to a security services request for coverage of the WRP that, quote, although the WRP was not considered to be a law and order problem, nevertheless, he was ready to put a source into the WRP if this would legitimately act as a stepping stone for a penetration of an SDS target. The lack of lawful justification for this type of SDS work for the security services was well understood by the Home Office, who can be seen commenting in 1980 that the 1970 terms of reference did not, quote, provide ministers or chief officers with a watertight basis on which to justify the work of police officers in investigating and recording the activities of the subversives. However, despite knowing that they were presiding over a system of unlawful state surveillance, it appears that in 1979 to 1980, on the recommendation of the head of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Robert P. Bryan, an early draft of the terms of reference was shelved on the grounds that, quote, it might stimulate more questions than it answered. The inquiry is presented with clear evidence of senior members of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch seeking to cover up and perpetuate the unlawful activities of the branch, which was typified by the SDS. In terms of external oversight of the SDS, Home Office communications to Sir Brian Cubban, the then permanent Under Secretary of State at the Home Office, noted that Her Majesty's Chief Inspectorate of Constabulary proposed that there should be a systematic planned inspection of all headquarters, special branch units and selected port units. However, on further consideration, it was thought that some chief officers might resist such an approach. It now seems that there was never any external oversight of the SDS or Metropolitan Police Special Branch during this era and beyond. And it would appear that this was a decision known about and sanctioned at the highest political level within the Home Office. The inquiry is here presented with clear evidence of Home Office complicity in covering up and insulating from external scrutiny the unlawful activities of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch as typified by the SDS. The non-state cooperating group asked the inquiry to investigate whether Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary ever came to learn about the existence of the SDS, and if not, why not? Who else was controlling and influencing the oversight and regulation of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch and the SDS, the group asked? Evidence has also emerged that in 1980, it was the security services that had a decisive hand in preventing the publication of a new branch terms of reference. This gives the inquiry an insight in the extent to which the security services exercised control over the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. However, the decisive factor, it seems, in closing the door on any form of regulatory framework or revised terms of reference appears to have been the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Mrs. Thatcher is noted as not sharing, quote, her predecessors' disquiet about the work of special branches. So I'm now going to say a few words about SDS rules and training. It was not just the political elite and the Metropolitan Police Special Branch hierarchy that resisted clear rules and guidance on undercover policing and surveillance. Whilst the architect of the SDS, Chief Inspector Conrad Dixon, authored the first guidance on the SDS in his Penetration of Extremist Groups, dated the 26th of November 1968, this document seemingly remained buried. This paper ran almost in parallel with the Home Office Circular 97-1969, entitled Informants Who Take Part in Crime. One would think that these documents would provide early, important guidance to the SDS. It seems, however, that they were ignored. Most importantly, these documents suggested that deployment should last no longer than 12 months, in recognition of the stresses of undercover life, unless there were special circumstances. Dixon also directed that members should not, quote, take office in groups, chair meetings, draft leaflets, speak in public, or initiate activity. However, these apparent rules were immediately broken, including by Dixon himself. Dixon, along with his fellow undercover officers, not only voted in meetings, but either Dixon or HN 329 also penned an article for Red Camden. The administrator, HN 3095, William Furner, who significantly is not being called to give evidence in T1, P3, characterises Dixon as having a, quote, very loose rein, whilst another manager, Ruby Wilson, describes him as being, quote, very free and easy. Did this approach become the blueprint for the SDS, the non-state cooperating group asked? Even in the early days, the deployments lasted significantly longer than Dixon himself considered appropriate. We can see that HN 68 Sean Lynch was in the field from 1968 to 1973. And by the mid-1970s, HN 200 Roger Harris was deployed from 1974 to 77, commenting, I was not told how long I would be in the SDS. I feel that for the first year you find your feet, the middle year is most effective, and in the third year there is a danger you could become careless or overconfident. For example, when I was nearing the end of my deployment, I signed one of my personal checks in my cover name. I knew the person serving me at the bank, and so it was not a problem, but it made me think it was time to stop working undercover. By the mid-1970s, the accepted duration became a standardised 4 years. We see HN 304 Graham Coates, 76 to 79. We see HN 354 Vincent Harvey, 76 to 79. HN 80 Colin Clark, 77 to 1982. We see HN 106 Barry Tompkins, 79 to 1983. And we see HN 155 Phil Cooper, 1979 to 1984. All of these undercover officers have indicated that they were told or expected their deployment to last around 4 years. in the words of HN80, to get the return on the investment. According to HN304, quote, I was told that my deployment would be 4 years. I was told that this was the perfect length because it would take 12 months to become properly efficient. But if the deployment was more than 4 years, I would either burn out or become stressed that I would be ineffective. The 4-year deployment remained in place since the 1980s, with the 1982 SDS annual report also noting that a tour of duty in the SDS was, quote, normally a maximum of 4 years. The non-state cooperating group want to understand whether there was a positive and considered managerial decision to extend all deployments well beyond 12 months, and if so, by whom? Were any risks taken into consideration, or were the undercover officers simply allowed to drift on without robust management and clear guidance? The length of deployments is a significant consideration. It is not rocket science that the longer an undercover officer is deployed, the greater chance there is of collateral intrusion, the development of close personal ties, sexual and intimate relationships, misconduct and abuse of power and trust. The extent to which managers knew about the risk of undercover officers engaging in sexual relationships when undercover is both highly sensitive and contentious. Roy Creamer says in his witness statement that, quote, I would give them fatherly advice, like not taking drugs, not getting involved with mischief, and not getting illnesses. Mischief and illnesses are curiously not defined. Managers clearly decided that married undercover officers were preferable for deployments. Very few are willing to admit, however, that this was an attempt to guard against sexual activity when undercover. It is of note that David Bicknell, a manager who oversaw the SDS move to S-Squad in 1974, he states, is quoted as saying, the reason married men were favoured is because it was considered that there would be less temptation for them to enter into inappropriate relationships with women. The maximum that an officer was allowed to be in a Harry was 2 years, and this was considered an absolute rule. End of quote. If there was an absolute 2-year rule, why was it so blatantly broken? Did the managers simply ignore the obvious risks, knowing what the inevitable consequences might be, particularly regarding inappropriate relationships? In terms of training, the undercover officers who gave evidence in T1, P1 and P2 have told this inquiry that the early guidance documents referred to above were not shown to them by managers, but some did seem to know from their basic police training that they should not commit crimes or have relationships when undercover. In the very early years of the SDS, Roy Creamer and Conrad Dixon had significant knowledge of left-wing politics and would provide political briefings. However, apart from some time in the back office, undercover officers reported having no or very scant training. There were certainly no trainings for undercover officers about not actively participating in groups, what intelligence to collect, and privacy concerns. Now, some officers have given evidence in closed hearings in Tranche 1 Phase 4, T1P4. These officers have reported the existence of a large, possibly black loose leaf folder with notations from previous officers on tradecraft. Why have all the undercover officers who've already given evidence in the open hearings not referred to this folder? The non-state cooperating group ask. This inquiry must, we say, look at the basic police training given to all undercover officers whilst attending Police Staff College at Bramshill. Police officers must surely have received basic training on legal principles and professional conduct, such as the lawfulness of entering a private property without a search warrant, engaging in sexual relationships whilst on duty, and participating in crimes. If so, how did undercover officers, and indeed any of the managers, reconcile this training with the undemocratic and illegitimate system of undercover policing that they encountered when they joined the SDS? It is also important for the inquiry to explore how managers themselves were trained. All the witness statements to date note that managers did not receive any training other than learning on the job. However, some managers previously worked in either B Squad or C Squad. It will be important for the inquiry to understand how prior management and police experience in the wider Metropolitan Police Special Branch influenced policing tactics developed by the SDS. Separately, how did inexperienced managers such as Derek Bryce and Geoffrey Craft, neither of whom had ever worked undercover in the SDS, learn about tradecraft? Did they also read the black loose leaf folder in the back office? The evidence to be heard from managers in T1, P3 on training and the evolution of tradecraft is of particular importance to the bereaved families of deceased children whose identities were used by the SDS. This is the period when the practice began, and the evidence from the managers is highly relevant to how that practice became normalised within the SDS, leading to its adoption as a tactic by the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. The theft of the identities of deceased children was an immoral and unlawful practice that set the tone for a unit that operated outside the usual legal and moral strictures of policing. I'm now going to make some comments on the topic of empire building funding and justification for the SDS. The non-state cooperating group do not accept that the NPS's public order explanation could ever justify and render lawful the activities of the SDS. Without prejudice to that view, it is, however, clear that the public order justifications put forward on behalf of the NPS, the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, and SDS simply do not stand up to scrutiny. The figures published by Stephen Taylor QC in January 2015 show the SDS budget allocation from the Home Office rose significantly from £3,000 in 1969 to £8,600 in 1975-6 and to £30,000 in 1982 to 1983. However, within the vast quantity of undercover reporting before this inquiry, there is very little evidence of reporting relevant to public disorder, the apparent raison d'etre of the SDS. The overwhelming majority of undercover surveillance and reporting disclosed to date focused on organisations that had absolutely no ability to be genuinely subversive. And as already established, this surveillance was known to be unlawful. Certain managers in T1, P3 seek to explain the lack of public order reporting by focusing on the fact that disclosure for this inquiry was largely obtained from the security services, and that there are apparently significant amounts of missing documents on SDS public order policing. This is simply not credible. There is little evidence within the T1 disclosure to support managers' assertions that the SDS was in fact successful in public order policing. The documents disclosed for T1 show that for a large part of the era under consideration by this inquiry, public disorder was on the wane. The memorandum of 19th of March 1976, prepared for the 1975 SDS annual report by Chief Inspector Derek Neal, notes that, quote, there has been, over the past years, been a decline in the disorders associated with political demonstrations. This annual report states that the biggest demonstration in 1975 had been organised by the National Abortion Campaign, which attracted 15 to 20,000 supporters. But it was noted that, quote, although this was a very emotive issue, there was no disorder. The 1976 annual report, authored by Chief Inspector Geoffrey Craft, seeks to justify the continuation of the SDS, not because it predicted and prevented significant public disorder in the previous year, but rather the exact opposite. The SDS had saved police time and numbers by showing that there was no threat to public disorder from planned demonstrations. Geoffrey Craft even boasts to the Home Office that this proved that, quote, demonstration assessment has been tuned into a fine art. Establishing that there was no risk of public disorder to save police resources does not justify the gross and unlawful infringement of rights and the invasion of privacy perpetuated by the SDS. The targeting of the Workers' Revolutionary Party by the SDS provides another perfect example of how far the SDS had drifted further into unlawful and shadowy work that posed no threat to public order. How can managers giving evidence to this inquiry be so sure that the SDS was making a positive and important contribution to public order policing during this T1 era? Is there any evidence that they were qualitatively assessing the usefulness of SDS reporting from a public order perspective? Is there any evidence that they sought and obtained feedback from their quote clients in public order divisions? The answer can only be no. It is clear from the manager's evidence to date that they are seeking to distance themselves from having any responsibility for assessing or questioning the qualitative value of undercover reporting. In terms of feedback, David Smith, the first office manager in the SDS between October 1970 and October 1974, does not recall ever getting feedback from the recipients of the intelligence. There is, however, a rare document in the T1 disclosure from 1978, which is a memorandum from the then newly appointed Detective Chief Inspector of the SDS, HM 135, Michael Ferguson, to the Detective Chief Superintendent of S Branch. This material is a defensive response to criticism apparently made by A Department's Deputy Assistant Commissioner about the accuracy of SDS intelligence from an ANL rally. The usefulness of the SDS to public order policing is best summarised by Roy Creamer when he states that, quote, the idea that the SDS would find out and reveal plans was wishful thinking, I think. In terms of Metropolitan Police Special Branch institutional analysis of the SDS contribution to public order policing, the most significant attempt at a review in the T1 era occurred on the 24th of February 1976. This is when Commander Matt Roger tasked Chief Inspector of S Squad Rollo Watts to set up a study group to assist in the forthcoming request for funding from the Home Office. Watts was asked to undertake a, quote, complete review of the squad. In light of the fact that, quote, over the past 7 years, however, this form of political activity by minority extremist groups has dwindled considerably. And with the exception of Red Lion Square conflict in 1974, and possibly one or two other incidents of deliberate confrontation, upsurges in violence on the streets have become less and less frequent. Now, 3 questions were posed, one of which was, quote, what proportion of the overall intelligence gathered is of primary benefit towards assisting uniformed police officers to control public meetings and demonstrations, and that which is of interest mainly to the security service. Chief Superintendents R. Wilson, HN 332, and Chief Inspector Derek Neal, and Detective Inspector Geoffrey Kraft were all part of the group under Watts. In his report back, Watts vigorously made the case for the continuation of the SDS. However, what is notable is that his report does not answer the question posed above on how much SDS work was dominated by the security services. What is both clear and significant, however, is an emphasis by Watts on the importance of the SDS intelligence for the security services. Watts dodged the public order question because no doubt he well understood that the vast majority of what the SDS were doing was deeply problematic and unjustifiable surveillance for the security services. This was clearly a lost opportunity for senior managers to give an honest appraisal of the utility, justification, and indeed lawfulness of the SDS, and to face up to the precise extent to which their role had become dominated by intelligence collection for the security services. Now, the SDS managers insist that the SDS benefited and improved the Metropolitan Police Special Branch's attitude to public order policing. However, this does not stand up to scrutiny. The significant public order events of this era, namely Red Lion Square, Southall, and Lewisham, were not preempted or policed successfully because of the work conducted by the SDS. The demonstration at Southall was undoubtedly a catastrophic failure of Metropolitan Police Special Branch policing, which resulted in the death of a teacher, Blair Peach, HM41, who gave evidence in the secret hearings in T1P4, spoke of, quote, disastrous mistakes in the public order planning for Southall, and that, quote, there was a perception that the public order branch weren't perhaps as receptive to some of our ideas as we thought they might have been. That was the impression I got from the management, because the Met with redacted and then with Southall had sort of significant problems that perhaps they needn't have had. The left wing and campaign groups that the SDS targeted were an inevitable reaction to the injustices in society, not the cause of public disorder. The failure of the SDS operations at Red Lion Square, Southall and Lewisham was the failure to recognise that the fundamental cause of public disorder at such events was public revulsion against fascist mobilisations and the police being seen to protect them. The managers were ultimately responsible for the quality, accuracy and relevance of the reporting being produced by their undercover officers whom they managed. There is evidence to suggest that some managers were aware of this and either tailored the reporting or turned a blind eye to irrelevant reporting. Roy Creamer comments in his witness statement that, quote, Comrade Dixon and I would discuss the information and then I would draft what I thought we should say in the report. I would put into words what I knew he ought to be saying. I was like Radar from MASH. The reference to Radar from MASH is both significant and telling. Derek Butler commented that this type of SDS deployment resulted in undercover officers becoming embedded for long periods when there was no scope for public order reporting and hence, quote, subconsciously at least, they felt obliged to earn their keep by turning in reports on membership, start points for future inquiries, and the internal dynamics of their group. This may have occasionally included gossip or irrelevance. Despite appreciating that undercover officers were reporting gossip and irrelevance, the managers giving evidence in T1 did not, by their own admission, undertake robust qualitative analysis of SDS reporting. They did not assess its value and usefulness in the public order field, or indeed in countering subversion. They did not see the threat assessments produced, if indeed any were produced from SDS reporting, and they did not obtain regular feedback. This underscores a significant and systemic flaw at the heart of the SDS. Managers did not conduct a detailed cost-benefit analysis weighing up the collateral damage that might be caused against the true value of the intelligence being obtained. As a result, they failed to consider the threat to freedom of speech and democratic principles posed by the SDS. These were obvious matters that were being raised in public, in Parliament, and went to the heart of the lawfulness and justification of the activities of the SDS. The non-state cooperating group want to know why these issues were not considered at the time. Why was there such a fundamental lack of critical thinking? These are important questions because it was the duty of managers to write in an honest way to the Home Secretary to request an extension of funding for the continuation of the SDS. As Geoffrey Craft states, quote, the annual reports were directed to the Home Office and pointing out the value of the SDS in terms of public order and seeking continuation for another year. End of quote. In signing off the annual reports and the accompanying memorandum, a manager, as a senior police officer, must have known that they were confirming the contents as accurate. The suggestion by Trevor Butler that his role was merely, quote, editorial, is not only a staggering admission of managerial failure, but also a blatant attempt to create distance from documents that are obviously flawed and misleading. I now turn to targeting and justification. The inquiry is tasked to answer several fundamental questions on the targeting of infiltrated groups. This is vital to understanding what went wrong and why. On the face of existing evidence, these were unlawful, ideologically motivated, and profoundly undemocratic political policing operations. There was no reasonable policing purpose proportionate to the level of intrusion involved. The answers to the above questions on targeting should have formed the bedrock of any possible justification of the lawfulness or necessity of these operations. Vague or non-existent answers are therefore damning in themselves and only serve to confirm what the evidence already suggests, that these operations were unjustified and unjustifiable violations of people's privacy and political rights, and that they were unlawful and unnecessary in a democratic society. The evidence from undercover officers paints a mixed picture on targeting. As the SDS evolved following the Grosvenor Square demonstrations, some undercover officers stated that they were tasked to infiltrate specific groups, whilst others described largely having a free rein and often drifting around left-wing or anarchist groups, reporting on whatever or whoever they came across. In terms of public order, the managers suggest that they were not fully responsible for targeting decisions. Both Barry Moss and Geoffrey Craft suggest that targeting came from C Squad, with references to daily discussions between the Commander of Operations and his operational chief superintendents. The managers within the SDS did influence and control targeting to some extent. For example, Barry Moss admits that on his arrival, he considered that, quote, the unit was a bit heavy on the Socialist Workers' Party, and so when HN19 was recruited, he was deployed to the RCP and the Communist Party of Great Britain Marxist-Leninist. However, what the managers are unified on is that direction to the SDS on targeting was coming from much more senior levels within the Metropolitan Police Special Branch and the Metropolitan Police Service. The managers must now explain what they know about the political direction in SDS targeting decisions. This is particularly important to Category E, trade unions and trade union members. In terms of the targeting of so-called subversives, we can see that this targeting direction clearly came from the security services. The non-state cooperating group invite the inquiry to explore with managers whether they shared the concerns of Commander Gilbert. Did managers query whether it was in fact lawful and appropriate in a democratic society for police officers to target groups and individuals engaged in lawful activities? We know that Barry Moss, for example, accepts that whilst he was undercover, he did not ever witness anything that was subversive. This echoes the evidence of many of the undercover officers who's already given evidence to this inquiry. It then begs the obvious question as to why the SDS continued in its unlawful surveillance of lawful democratic activities and why more questions weren't asked. I'm now going to turn to welfare and supervision. As this inquiry has already heard, the T1 era marks the emergence of inappropriate and abhorrent behaviour by undercover officers, whilst they were being actively managed and where managers were visiting the safe houses approximately twice a week. It is shocking to the non-state cooperating group that all of the managers who are due to give oral evidence in T1P3 and those who provided witness statements for this phase deny having any knowledge of both inappropriate sexual relationships and any of the deeply sexist and misogynistic banter that it is now clear took place in the safe house when managers were present. This is particularly so in light of the evidence that has recently emerged from the T1P4 secret hearings, where undercover officers also talk about sexist banter and joking about sexual conquests when undercover. Unfortunately, the non-state cooperating group could not explore this evidence further as it was given in secret. The managers are at pains to point out that their primary duty was the welfare of undercover officers. This was recognised as a vital function given the unique stress of undercover work. Almost every SDS annual report to the Home Office emphasises the close supervision of officers and managerial attention to welfare. It is therefore shocking for the non-state cooperating group that despite the evidence this inquiry has already heard, Geoffrey Craft still maintains in his witness statement that, quote, I do not think any police officers were more carefully monitored than this lot. Despite this bold assertion, Geoffrey Craft and Angus McIntosh both deny knowing that HN 297 Rick Clark and HN 300 Jim Pickford engaged in sexual relationships with activists, with the latter falling in love and leaving his wife. We know from the gysted evidence disclosed in preparation for the secret hearings in T1P4 that an undercover officer reports Geoffrey Craft specifically advising against sexual relationships, stating, quote, "It would be beyond stupid and cause all sorts of problems." This inquiry must get to the bottom of the manager's attitudes to sexual relationships and pin down exactly what is meant by all sorts of problems. The judgment of the Investigatory Powers Tribunal in the case of Kate Wilson versus Commissioner of the Metropolis and National Police Chiefs Council of 2021 specifically concluded that violations of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights and miscarriages of justice were ignored because managers put first the maintaining of secrecy of the undercover operation and ensuring a continuation of funding. The non-state cooperating group have also recently learnt that Rick Clark had a reputation for being, quote, "a bit of a lad," which included, quote, womanising. However, again, the non-state cooperating group discover in the gysted material from the secret hearings in T1P4 that HN 300 was, quote, "a sexual predator" and, quote, "was confined to the office because he was an alcoholic." An undercover officer in these secret hearings in T1P4 also clearly states that it was Angus McIntosh who dealt with HN 300 falling in love when undercover. This is conspicuously absent from Angus McIntosh's witness statement. Geoffrey Craft continues to claim no knowledge of the activities of HN 13 Barry Desmond Loader, who was arrested twice in 1977 and 1978. The documents disclosed to date highlight other managers interfering in the court process, with an update even being given to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. It is simply inexplicable to suggest that such matters would be hidden from Geoffrey Craft, who was a Detective Chief Inspector in the SDS. This inquiry must press the managers to explain these glaring contradictions in the evidence. Were managers deliberately overstating their monitoring and supervision of undercover officers, or did they know what was going on and willfully turn a blind eye? Or was it the case that they positively sanctioned such conduct to maximise the product for their customers? Finally, a glaring omission in relation to welfare in the annual reports and witness evidence is any suggestion that efforts were made to check and protect the welfare of those targeted and reported on, including any consideration for the welfare of the families of the deceased children whose identities were being used. As we can see from the T1P4 secret hearings, undercover officers attended weddings and funerals of those being targeted, spent time in their private homes, and even babysat young children when undercover. I now turn to make a few comments about the SDS annual reports. In terms of significant management failures and the accuracy and honesty of the SDS annual reports, certain undercover officers and deployments stand out. HN 155 Phil Cooper was deployed between 1979 and January 1984, when the following managers were in post: Barry Moss, Mike Ferguson, Trevor Butler, Nigel David Short, HN 68 Sean Lynch, and HN 45 Dave Robertson. HN 155 infiltrated the Waltham Forest anti-nuclear campaign, the Socialist Workers' Party and the Right to Work campaign. He gained two notable positions of responsibility: as a treasurer in the Waltham Forest anti-nuclear campaign and then in the Right to Work campaign. Reporting, signed off by the manager Dave Short, notes that in the Right to Work campaign, Ernie Roberts MP was nominally the treasurer, while HN 155 signed the cheques and controlled the account, a significant position of responsibility and control. Now, there came a time when managers realised that HN 155 was a problematic officer. on the 29th of June, 1982, it is recorded by the security services that the managers, HN68 Sean Lynch and Dave Short, reported that there were serious doubts about the performance of HN 155 and that his, quote, days were numbered, end of quote, due to other, quote, misdemeanors, and that he was soon to be withdrawn. Incidentally, it is in the same note that reference is made to HN 106 Barry Tompkins having bedded blank and been warned off by his bosses. On the 30th of July 1982, HN 68 Sean Lynch told the security services that, quote, despite his misdemeanors, Cooper has not been withdrawn as an SDS source. There is a further reference in this document to the manager HN 68 being, quote, slightly worried by the case because Cooper's position in the right to work movement gives him regular access to Ernie Roberts MP and meetings at the House of Commons, end of quote. It is clear that HN 68 Sean Lynch was in fact really concerned about the lawfulness of HN 155's actions. It seems that he understood the potential scandal that would erupt in Parliament if it ever came to light that the Metropolitan Police Special Branch and SDS were conducting covert surveillance in close proximity to, and quite possibly on, a sitting member of Parliament and in Parliament itself. The security services, however, didn't appear to raise an eyebrow. HN 155 remained in post. HN 155 initially admitted to a risk assessor that he had engaged in 2, 3, or possibly more sexual relationships when undercover, but he later then denied this. Julia Poynter, a witness to this inquiry, met HN 155 in the Waltham Forest anti-nuclear campaign. Julia refers to HN 155 regularly getting stoned and on one occasion being so inebriated he fell off his chair and broke it. HN 155 said in a risk assessment interview that he, quote, lived a full and alternative life. In a medical interview on the 12th of November 2020, HN 155 admitted that he was, quote, a heavy drinker during undercover deployment years with occasional drug taking as part of the scene. Undercover officer drug taking is also referenced in the T1 P4 closed officer gist, and it is a topic that will feature in Tranche 2. Trevor Butler was the manager who signed off the 1979 and the 1981 annual reports to the Home Office. And in both reports, he was at great pains to emphasise the close supervision that he and his fellow managers exercised over all undercover officers, stating in the 1979 annual report that, quote, the nature of the delicate and difficult duty performed by SDS operational officers renders it imperative that close supervision and attention to welfare are continually maintained. The 1981 annual report, written in 1982 by Trevor Butler, also stressed on the issue of welfare that the close supervision exercised is essential. But curiously, the Right to Work March occupies 7 lines in the 1981 SDS annual report and is described as the Socialist Workers' Party's, quote, notable adventure. There is no reference to public disorder. And indeed, we know that the march itself, in which HN 155 played a key role, was not even considered a public order risk by manager Barry Moss. The events were of such limited importance that they did not even feature in the 1981 Metropolitan Police Special Branch annual report. What is conspicuous by its absence in this SDS 1981 SDS annual report is any mention of HN 155 acting as a treasurer alongside an elected MP, that HN 155 was drinking to excess, drug taking, and having sexual relationships when undercover. There is also no mention that HN 106 was bedding a woman, which was tarnishing his intelligence. Why is it that the Home Office was not being told about this undercover officer activity by Trevor Butler? Was it because Trevor Butler knew that he was the one who placed HN 155 in the Right to Work campaign? I'm going to make some comments about racism. In the T1 era and beyond, the SDS and the Metropolitan Police Special Branch were fixed in their own deeply politicised, racist and misogynistic narratives, which saw public order as inextricably linked to organised groups on the left. The Metropolitan Police Special Branch and the SDS seemed incapable of appreciating that in a democratic society, citizens could campaign against injustice and demand social change on matters of social and public importance, such as racism, without being subversive. This is classically exemplified by the comments of Rollo Watts, recorded on the 15th of October 1976, where he told the security services, quote, that there had been a build-up of racial tensions in Brixton, and the Metropolitan Police Special Branch are undertaking a study of the problem to commence in Brixton, and one of its most important aspects was to discover to what extent left-wing extremists were influencing the coloured population in this area. The review section of the 1981 annual report clearly shows that 1981 was a deeply unsuccessful year for the SDS. They were focused on peaceful marches and rallies on wage poverty and the campaign for nuclear disarmament. The Brixton riots in April 1981 were amongst the most significant public order events of the period. They were not caused by the left-wing campaign groups, but were spontaneous and uncoordinated uprisings against racist policing. This was simply not understood or honestly reflected upon by the SDS in the 1981 annual report, despite the findings of the Scarman inquiry. The SDS seemed incapable of honestly appraising the roots and causes of public disorder in the T1 era. I'm going to make some comments now in relation to misogyny. In the same way that racism and political bias undermine the Metropolitan Police Special Branch and the SDS response to popular protests in Brixton, there were parallels in the way in which women were perceived and treated. It is clear that a pernicious culture of misogyny contributed to highly inappropriate policing decisions affecting women. The non-state cooperating group know that the SDS considered it was appropriate to target women campaigning around reproductive rights and fair pay as they were deemed to be subversive. Managers thought nothing of belittling these women in sexist and derogatory ways, such as the comment that, quote, 500 women, many patently emotionally unstable and quite paranoidally opposed to men, end of quote, attended the Women's Liberation Spring Conference. Throughout this time, there is strong evidence to suggest that managers repeatedly either condoned or turned a blind eye to increasingly frequent incidents of inappropriate sexual behaviour by their officers, as well as misogynistic banter. The fact that such banter was considered harmless and not worthy of managerial challenge is evidence itself of deep-seated institutional misogyny. This managerial attitude is perfectly illustrated by the following comment in the witness statement of HN 368, Richard Walker, who on sexist safe house banter stated, quote, men who say things about women don't always mean it or follow through with what they say. Ironically, managers, and indeed the Metropolitan Police Special Branch hierarchy, were more than willing to keep an extremely close eye on some undercover officer relationships with women, but only when it suited their interests. When the Metropolitan Police Special Branch received an anonymous letter about undercover officer HM126 Paul Gray having a sexual relationship with another police officer in police accommodation, Barry Moss paid a visit to the wife of HM126 Paul Gray. Barry Moss subsequently described the wife as, quote, a strong woman and not in need of any welfare support, which may give the inquiry an indication of the tone of the meeting. The wife's handwriting was obtained and sent for analysis, and this outcome, which was that she probably wrote the anonymous letter, was presented to her by Barry Moss. Presumably, the objective was to intimidate her into remaining silent about the concerns she had about the sexual activity of her husband, HM126 Paul Gray. Concerns which, it seems, were not investigated. It is telling that managers in the Metropolitan Police Special Branch senior hierarchy thought that it was appropriate and lawful to use police resources in such an illegitimate and corrupt manner to cover up potential undercover officer misdeeds rather than consider the substance of the allegations that were being made. In other words, serious police misconduct. It seems that protecting the SDS took precedence over all considerations, and it seems that no action was off limits, no matter how unlawful. The non-state cooperating group draw a parallel here between the unlawful use of police resources against an innocent woman to protect the SDS and the approach taken by the SDS management to justice campaigns, also considered to pose a threat, such as the Friends of the Blair Peach Committee and the Stephen Lawrence campaign. Managers justified the use of identities of deceased children with reference to the fact that they thought that the families of such children would never find out or know. This is another illustrative example of a pervasive belief within the SDS that no one would ever find out about their operations. It gave undercover officers a license to act unchecked and outside the parameters of the law. Now, so just some short comments on blacklisting. The chair will recall the comments made on behalf of the Metropolitan Police Service in their opening statement for T1P2 on so-called blacklisting organisations and the upset that this caused amongst non-state cooperating group who have suffered so acutely as a result of blacklisting. The latest disclosure in T1P3 sheds more light on blacklisting by the security services in government departments and certain public corporations, including the BBC and firms which have not been disclosed. The documents show the tension between the security services and the Metropolitan Police Special Branch on who controls the passing of intelligence and vetting, with the security services indicating that, quote, security service is the normal channel for passing security information. In an emphatic response to the security services dated the 10th of November 1975, the Metropolitan Police Special Branch makes clear that they will continue to pass security information as the Metropolitan Police Special Branch has built up contacts in the civil service, armed forces and other organisations which employ former police officers and with whom there exists a, quote, close and mutually profitable relationship. The Metropolitan Police Special Branch were clear that they were going to continue facilitating blacklisting. The managers of the SDS now need to explain which of their intelligence was collected or used for this abhorrent and devastating purpose. In terms of specific examples of blacklisting, we know that the SDS were tasked to spy on the Workers' Revolutionary Party, and in particular, Roy Battersby. That intelligence was provided to the security services, who were expressly given the task of collating files in order to vet those seeking posts in sensitive government bodies, including, as I've mentioned, the BBC. Indeed, the BBC have confirmed and described this process. As is clear from Roy Battersby's statement, there is clear evidence that as a BAFTA winner, he is one of those who was blacklisted. He was by no means the only one. This creates a very clear paper trail of blacklisting directly implicating the SDS. As Roy Battersby makes clear in his own statement, this practice was an attack on the democratic process, elections, privacy, and freedom of political and artistic expression, and in particular, the plurality of voices and standpoints of our national broadcaster, the BBC. So I'll now turn to some very brief points on procedural issues. The non-state cooperating group has raised a number of important procedural matters in the written opening statement, but given the limited time, I will not deal with these matters today. I do, however, want to make 4 short points. The first relates to delay, and as I've already stated at the outset, the non-state cooperating group does remain extremely concerned about the progress of this inquiry, and I want to again reiterate the request for a clear timetable for the inquiry's ongoing work. The second point relates to your intention, sir, to publish an interim report as set out by counsel to the inquiry, Mr. Barr QC, in his opening statement for Tranche 1, Phase 3. In due course, the non-state cooperating group will seek to address this issue and ask that a timetable for submissions is set down to allow this to happen. The third point I wish to address relates to the further investigations that are being made by this inquiry to gather evidence relevant to the SDS from the wider Metropolitan Police Special Branch. The non-state cooperating group has always maintained that investigating the SDS cannot take place in a vacuum. It is now clear from the managers who are soon to give evidence that in some of the T1 era, targeting was being directed and influenced from outside the SDS by the security services and others. SDS interaction with the security services is a key component in the preliminary draft Module 2B issues list. The non-state cooperating group intends to address the inquiry on the scope of its investigations relating to the security services after T1P3 and in the first instance as part of this consultation on Module 2B issues list. The fourth point so relates to future hearings. Given the length of time between the T1P3 hearings and T2, the non-state cooperating group requests that the chair, Sir, you schedule regular public inquiry management hearings in advance of T2. There are now a range of important matters, such as, for example, the interim report, the scope of investigations by security services, and of course, the legal framework, which should be considered after formal written and oral submissions from all core participants. It is also essential that these important matters are raised and considered in public hearings so that the public and core participants can see the process by which decisions are made. The non-state cooperating group suggests that formal hearings are often the most productive forum in which to seek to resolve matters in a way that best assists the inquiry. So just some very short concluding observations. The wrongdoing engaged in by the SDS was not an exception to an otherwise lawful and justified policing operation. Rather, the SDS was, from its very inception, unlawful and in contravention of basic policing principles and a threat to democracy. However, this was no accident. Mark Ellison QC and Operation Hearn were right to suggest that the failures of SDS management were in part caused by secrecy and the lack of external scrutiny. The SDS was not simply a rogue unit operating in hiding and insulated from internal Metropolitan Police Special Branch and Home Office scrutiny. The SDS was specifically designed to remain a secret from the public and from Parliament. It was only by remaining under a cloak of secrecy that the SDS could carry out the type of surveillance activities that were not and are not permitted in a democratic society. Other than a select few, many in the Home Office were simply not aware. Those in power who did know sanctioned the evolution of the SDS and took every opportunity on behalf of the governments of the day to ensure the SDS remained a secret. The judgment of the Investigatory Powers Tribunal in Wilson that I've already mentioned puts beyond doubt that undercover policing operations of the SDS and later units violated fundamental human rights. The non-state cooperating group endorse and adopts the opening statement made by Charlotte Kilroy QC on behalf of the Category H core participants. Many of the managers giving evidence in T1P3 make reference to the fact that the SDS practices went on over 50 years ago and should be considered in their historical context. However, this is simply not correct. The illegitimate surveillance, political policing, and abhorrent and unlawful tradecraft and misogyny, which was allowed to become embedded in T1, 1968 to 1962, set the course for all of the future undercover policing operations. These abhorrent practices survived and even flourished following legal reforms, such as those introduced by the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000. This will be explored in later tranches. A fundamental purpose of this inquiry is to identify why there was such a catastrophic failure of policing at the heart of British democracy, and such identification must be rigorously pursued during the T1P3 hearings. The non-state cooperating group and the public are demanding answers. These can only be obtained by a thorough and effective investigation in public and with full disclosure. This inquiry should not cut corners for reasons of political or financial expediency. This is the only way that the victims of unlawful state surveillance can achieve truth and justice, and the only way to ensure that these fundamental breaches of human rights will never happen again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. We will now break for, I think, 10 minutes until we have the next stage, which will be a reading of summaries of the evidence of 2 non-state witnesses, which will then conclude proceedings for today. Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, is that Jen?
Hello?
Yeah, is that Jen?
Yes, it is.
Is that Jen? Yeah, okay. We're just about to get, you'll come on in about 5 seconds. You'll need to switch your camera on as well.
I can't, it's saying I can't start the video without, because my
Is that
host
Jen?
stopped it. It is.
Is that Jen? Yeah, okay. We're just about to get, you'll come on in about 5 seconds. You'll need to switch your camera on as well.
I can't, it's saying I can't start the video without my host
Jen?
stopped it.
Miss Malcolm.
I'm grateful, sir. I shall be reading the summaries of 2 witness statements from non-state witnesses. I shall start with the statement of Madeleine. This is a summary of the second witness statement of core participant Madeleine, dated the 16th of March 2022. The full witness statement will be published on the inquiry's website later on today. This is a supplemental witness statement to her first witness statement, which is dated the 18th of February 2021. Madeleine gave evidence in May 2021 during the Tranche 1 Phase 2 or T1P2 hearings that she was deceived into a relationship with HN354, known by the cover name Vince Miller, during the period of the summer and into early autumn of 1979. This second witness statement addresses 3 issues. 1, a postcard that she received from Vince Miller at the end of his deployment. 2, the revocation of the restriction order over Vince Miller's real name and disclosure of his real name, Vincent James Harvey. And 3, a report which had not been previously disclosed to her and which relates to an event that she believes that she was present at. Issue 1. On the first issue, Madeleine states that after the UCPI hearings in May 2021, she decided to look at a box containing letters and cards of emotional significance from old boyfriends and close friends. At the bottom of this box, she found a postcard from Vince Miller, dated January 1980, with a United States airmail stamp addressed to Madeleine, Dave and Co. And this is now Madeleine's Exhibit 3. It reads as follows. Open quote, didn't stay long in New York, not my kind of place. Have bussed and driven hire cars down here for the winter. Lost my address book, so can only write to people whose addresses I can remember, and these might not be right. Music and people really better than I expected. All in all, a lot better than Walthamstow. Having a bit of trouble getting enough money for everything I want to do, so travelling and living in an old VW wreck. Nothing new. Good luck to everybody, Vince. Close quote. Madeleine states that it is written in the handwriting of Vince Miller. She estimates that it arrived 3 months after he had disappeared, saying that he was going to America. She says that she had forgotten its existence, but does now vaguely recall receiving it and being pleasantly surprised and hopeful that his keeping in touch meant that she would see him again. She had put it in the box because it had meant something to her. Madeleine also recalls that a friend of hers from the SWP had visited Vince Miller's flat around Christmas 1979 to check if he was okay, because he had not been seen in some time. The friend told Madeleine that the door had been answered by, open quote, 2 dodgy looking men, end quote, who asked him a lot of questions and told him that Vince had gone to America. Madeleine states that she was surprised by this information because Vince Miller had told her he lived alone in a bedsit and there had been no answer on each occasion that she had visited the flat. It is Madeleine's belief that this postcard would have been received shortly after her friend's visit to the flat, and she questions whether it was sent in order to divert any suspicions that could have arisen from the friend's visit. Madeleine also notes that Vincent Harvey had said in his witness statement that he left Vince Miller and his deployment behind him when he left the field and had not thought of or talked about his former targets at all until his first interview with a risk assessor in 2018. He made no mention of this postcard sent by him 3 months after the deployment. Issue 2. In Vincent Harvey's supplementary impact statement of the 9th of March 2021, which addressed the reasons he believed the restriction order over his real name should not be revoked, he stated that he'd always been honest and open with the inquiry. One particular concern that he raised was that publication of his real name prior to his giving evidence, open quote, risked having a seriously adverse impact on an immediate family member, close quote. In March 2021, Madeleine was told that although the restriction order would ultimately be revoked, it was imperative that nothing was done to cause difficulties to the aforementioned family member, and she was given a choice. She could find out Vince Miller's real name prior to both of them giving evidence while still subject to the restriction order, prohibiting wider disclosure, or she could await revocation of the restriction order. Madeleine states that she weighed up the issues, and while she did not, open quote, believe that there was any real risk to the immediate family member, close quote, she did have sympathy for this family member, and she did not want to cause this individual anxiety by publication of Vince Miller's real name. She also wished to avoid being caused extra stress from being in receipt of information that she could not share. She therefore decided to wait to learn his real name until the restriction order had been revoked. On the 21st of September 2021, the restriction order was revoked, and Madeleine learned that Vince Miller's real name was Vincent James Harvey. This led to her discovery of more information about him and his career trajectory, some of which she found shocking. This, she states, cast him and the evidence that he had given in a different light. She had previously understood from the evidence disclosed to her that following his deployment in the Special Demonstration Squad, Vincent Harvey had been assured that he would only be in non-public facing roles, with the result that he spent 30 years being careful about his security, and which would be blown away if his real name was released. She had also understood that he had risen to the rank of Detective Chief Inspector in Special Branch and then left the Metropolitan Police Service to join another force. Madeleine states that she was therefore extremely disturbed to learn that Vincent Harvey had gone on to perform very senior and high-profile roles within the police, and that his real name and image were in the public domain through multiple media appearances. Madeleine states that she was, open quote, chilled to learn that he had been promoted to the rank of superintendent in the police service before becoming National Director of the National Criminal Intelligence Service, or NCIS, close quote. She questions why someone who had risen to such a senior rank in the police and in such a public-facing role was granted a restriction order over their real name, and why this was not revoked before he gave evidence at the hearings. It is Madeleine's belief that if his real name had been known at the time he gave evidence, and it had been known that he was a former director of the NCIS and a highly public figure, there would have been greater public scrutiny and press interest, which may have led to new witnesses, including possibly other deceived women, coming forward to the inquiry. The discovery that he was not only a police officer, but a senior one, has had a significant further adverse impact on her, and led to her feeling as she did when she was first contacted by the inquiry in 2020. She also feels that she was, open quote, emotionally manipulated by Vincent Harvey in his reliance on privacy concerns arising out of the potential adverse impact on a family member without corresponding honesty, at least in the material given to me, about how he had conducted his career, close quote. Madeleine states that if she had known of his career trajectory in March 2021, it would have changed the outcome of the balancing exercise that she undertook. Madeleine notes that no other former officers gave evidence to the inquiry about Vincent Harvey's relationships, and she queries if this was as a result of his seniority as an officer. The lack of knowledge of his real identity at the time of the hearings meant that her legal team could not propose questions to the other officers in order to explore if his role and profile within the force motivated their reluctance to give evidence on his behaviour. She states that this denied opportunity is of great concern to her. Issue 3. In relation to the third issue, Madeleine reiterates a concern that she raised in her first witness statement. In that statement, she indicated that she thought it extremely unlikely that the 23 documents which she had received in her witness pack were the only documents held by the inquiry which related to her contact with Vincent Harvey. She was particularly concerned that she'd not been provided with any document which covered the period of the relationship. Madeleine has subsequently come across a further intelligence report containing information obtained by Vincent Harvey, which was disclosed in the T1P2 bundle, but which was not in her witness pack. It is a report dated the 25th of September 1979, at a time towards the end of her relationship with Vincent Harvey, and relates to a Waltham Forest district meeting which took place in her home. Madeleine states that she generally attended most branch and district meetings and, open quote, certainly almost all of those that took place in my house, close quote. Whilst Madeleine states that she cannot be absolutely certain that she was present at this meeting, as the report records a fairly mundane meeting and at which nothing memorable took place, she thinks it extremely likely that she would have been present, given that it took place at her home. Despite this, she is not listed as an attendee. It is her belief that Vincent Harvey purposefully omitted her name, and because this report had been omitted from her witness pack, he could not be questioned on a potential tactic of undercover officers omitting the names of the women they deceived from their reports. Madeleine is also concerned that the report included in the T1P2 bundle included her full address at the time, and which she believes had the potential to undermine her anonymity order via a mosaic effect. It is Madeleine's understanding from the designated lawyer's opening statement for T1P2 that although 65 reports thought to have been authored by Vincent Harvey were disclosed in the T1P2 hearing bundle, there are a further 175 reports which the inquiry attributes to him, but which have not been disclosed to non-state core participants. Madeleine suggests that these 175 reports could relate to other events that she attended with Vincent Harvey, but is not listed on the report as having attended. Madeleine explains that as a woman deceived into a relationship, she experienced the gravest violation of her privacy, and that in order for the inquiry and the public to discover the truth about that violation, she had to stand up and recount details of her most intimate life, which she found excruciating. She further explains the impact on her of giving oral evidence to the inquiry and records how difficult and stressful she found the questioning. Madeleine states, open quote, "It was also insulting and offensive to hear Harvey claim that he could not remember our relationship and to suggest to the chair that I may have been lying about it in order to discredit the police," close quote. Madeleine states that as a result of press coverage of her oral evidence, her son found out that her first marriage had been abusive, which was distressing for him. His distress has also impacted on her. That's the end of the first summary, sir. If I turn to the second summary, this is a summary of the witness statement of Julia Poynter, dated the 11th of March, 2022, which has been voluntarily provided to the undercover policing inquiry after Miss Poynter's discovery that the men she knew as Vince Miller and Phil Cooper were undercover officers, respectively HN 354, whose real name is Vince Harvey, and HN 155, whose real name is subject to a restriction order. The full statement will be published on the inquiry's website today with the accompanying exhibits. Julia Poynter states that she was shocked and angered when she was provided with 62 intelligence reports in which she was named, which revealed the extensive invasion of her privacy by undercover officers. Her witness statement provides evidence about the two undercover officers she knew, and in particular about the deceitful sexual relationship between Vince Miller and her friend Madeleine. She states that she wishes to place the reporting of these officers in its true context. By way of background, Julia Poynter states that she first became politically active whilst at school, joining the Labour Party, with whom she soon became disillusioned. She came across the Socialist Workers' Party, or SWP, then known as the International Socialists, towards the end of her sixth form, and she was drawn to their version of socialism. She became a member in 1975 and remained a member for 5 years. She was initially active in the Walthamstow branch and then the Leytonstone branch when she moved sometime in 1978. Her main focus from 1977 onwards was her anti-racism work through her involvement with the Anti-Nazi League, which was closely affiliated with the SWP at that time. She explains that the late 1970s was a time of high unemployment and that the National Front were very active, particularly in East London, where she lived. In 1980, she began studying at college, where for a short period she attended socialist meetings before deciding that student politics did not suit her. She remained active with the Anti-Nazi League until 1981, but left the SWP in 1980, losing touch with most of her former contacts. Julia Poynter remained involved in politics subsequently, spending many years working in local government and being active in trade unions. It was through her involvement with union work that she became aware of the inquiry. She attended a union-backed conference in November 2019 on undercover policing and trade unions, and then attended a talk arranged by Unite, given by one of the women deceived by an undercover officer. Julia Poynter was then sufficiently interested to listen to the UCPI hearings in May 2021, where she heard evidence being given about events and groups that she'd been involved in. She eventually deduced that the witness that she was listening to was Madeleine, and that she was describing the Vince from Walthamstow that she had known. She was shocked to hear that Vince claimed to have had a, open quote, one night stand with Madeleine, close quote. Ms. Poynter states that not long after the hearings, and purely by chance, she bumped into Madeleine, who she had not seen in over 30 years. Madeleine confirmed that Vince was an undercover officer with the name Vince Miller. Madeleine also told her that a male she knew as Phil, and who had been a regular visitor at her home, was also an undercover officer. Ms. Poynter states that she knew Vince's claim about the nature of his relationship with Madeleine was untrue, and this is why she has offered to give evidence to the inquiry. Vince Miller. Julia Poynter first met Vince when he started coming to Walthamstow's SWP branch meetings around 1977. Weekly meetings were held in the Rose and Crown pub in Walthamstow, with an average of 12 to 15 attendees. It was a close-knit, friendly group, and Vince quickly made friends and became popular in the group. Ms. Poynter explains that people not only attended demonstrations but socialised together and would often have a drink in the pub after meetings and then go back to the shared house in which Madeleine lived, which was a social hub. Vince was also one of the few members of the group who had a vehicle, and he used his van to help deliver the SWP papers or to help people, such as by moving furniture. He was considered to be trustworthy and reliable, and he came across as a kind and considerate person. And until her discovery as to his real identity, she had thought him as one of the loveliest people that she had ever met. Julia Poynter recalls when Vince told her in the autumn of 1979 that he was leaving for America. She and her then boyfriend held a leaving party for him at their flat. Her boyfriend was also active in the Walthamstow branch of the SWP, and he was a chef and put a lot of effort into the meal for the leaving party. They both liked Vince and were sad to see him leave. Julia Poynter denies the claim made by Vince Miller, both in his risk assessment for his anonymity application and in his oral evidence to the inquiry at the hearings in May 2021, that she had wanted to have a relationship with him and that she had made this clear to him, but that he had not reciprocated because it was contrary to SDS directions and because he was told that it would not be a good idea. It is Ms. Poynter's belief that what he has said in these two occasions shows that he knew that he should not have been engaging in any sexual relationships. Madeleine's relationship with Vince Miller. Julia Poynter met Madeleine within a year of joining the SWP, and they all got on well and became close friends, spending time together at meetings, social events, and going on holiday together on a couple of occasions. Julia states that they confided in each other about their personal lives, and she remembers Madeleine discussing her relationship with Vince, which she knew was a sexual relationship. It was clear that Madeleine liked him. Miss Poynter recalls Madeleine telling her that Vince would always leave her flat in the middle of the night, and that both she and Madeleine thought that this was odd. Madeleine told her that Vince had grown up in care and that this had affected him. Julia Poynter spent time with both Madeleine and Vince at branch social activities during the few months that they were together. And whilst she knew that they were an item, this would not necessarily have been obvious to lots of other people. She recalls how disappointed Madeleine was when Vince ended the relationship after a few months, and that she seemed very sad following the breakup. Julia also remembers Madeleine being shocked and upset at the news that Vince had left for America. Phil Cooper. Miss Poynter met Phil Cooper through Waltham Forest Anti-Nuclear Campaign, or the WFANC, around 1980. Her boyfriend at the time had been active in its setup alongside Phil. For a time, she thinks that her boyfriend was secretary of the group and Phil was the treasurer. Phil attended WFANC meetings at their house and also came to their house for drinking sessions with her boyfriend and another friend. Miss Poynter got annoyed to find them all there when she got home from a night shift. She has recently got back in touch with that friend, and he reminded her that after she had, open quote, kicked the three of them out of the flat, close quote, they started going to the friend's house where Phil regularly got, open quote, stoned, close quote. Julia Poynter and her boyfriend went away with Phil for several days in September 1980 for the fringe meeting organised by the Anti-Nuclear Campaign at the TUC conference. She and her boyfriend are listed as being present in the SDS report of this event. Ms. Poynter states that they spent their time leafleting delegates at the conference to come to the fringe meeting, and they stayed in a campsite. And she produces a photograph of herself and Phil from this event as her Exhibit 1. Julia Poynter also recalls going with Phil and others from the SWP branch to an anti-Nazi League demonstration held to counter the National Front presence among West Ham supporters on the 8th of April 1981. Phil took them in his van. Miss Poynter has been provided with an intelligence report from this event, which claims that the actions of the uniformed police on that day had prevented clashes between the rival groups and that the police had allowed the anti-National Front protesters to reassemble after being split up. Miss Poynter's recollection of that event differs to that of the author of the report, and she records that they were not split up, no help was provided by the police, and that public disorder was prevented by the quality of the organising by the Anti-Nazi League. Miss Poynter recalls that Phil talked of having a girlfriend who was a single parent and that he often went away to stay with her. He said he worked as a delivery driver for a firm supplying marble, and although she never saw him work, he did turn up one day with a large slab of marble, and she still has it and has supplied a photograph of it as her Exhibit 2. Julia Poynter lost touch with Phil after she and her boyfriend split up in early 1981. The SWP. Miss Poynter states that her involvement with the SWP was limited to branch activity and that she was not active in the wider organisation. The activities she took part in were mostly different forms of outreach, selling the Socialist Worker newspaper every Saturday and putting on lots of public meetings to attract people to listen to their ideas about creating a fairer and more just society. She describes attending various picket lines in order to show support and solidarity to striking workers. She disputes the claims made by Phil that those who attempted to cross the picket line and return to work were threatened with violence, and states that the SWP chose to support those in picket lines by providing support to striking workers and sought to dissuade those who tried to cross the picket line by explaining the purpose of the picket. She also disputes the claims made in the witness statements of both Vince Miller and Phil Cooper that the SWP was subversive and that spying on them was justified. The Anti-Nazi League. Julia Poynter explains that much of her involvement in the Walthamstow SWP from late 1977 until 1981 was through her involvement in the Anti-Nazi League, which had formed in response to the rise of the far right. She recalls that on the 13th of August 1977, she and comrades from the branch attended the counter-protest to show solidarity with the people of Lewisham in response to the National Front march through New Cross, an event later known as the Battle of Lewisham. Ms. Poynter cannot specifically recall Vince being present on the counter-protest, but does remember vividly the chaos of the day. She notes the claims that Vince makes in his witness statement that the night before the demonstration, he and others from the SWP hid bricks along the route, and she states that this does not ring true and is not something that the SWP would have done. the SWP never took weapons to demonstrations. She says, open quote, violence was simply not what we were about, close quote. The SWP relied on large numbers rather than violence to discourage the National Front from attacking. The inquiry has provided Julia Poynter with 62 intelligence reports. Most of the reports are of the Walthamstow branch or Outer East London District SWP meetings, which she is listed as attending, or lists of attendees of specific demonstrations of which she is one. She states that due to the passage of time, she cannot recall all of the individual events, but she provides her recollection on those that she can remember. Julia Poynter observes that the earliest intelligence report in her witness pack is one from a branch meeting on the 11th of May 1977, in which her name is listed as an attendee with the accompanying note, open quote, mentioned anti-fascist demonstration at Duckett's Common in 1977, close quote, a demonstration that she had attended. By this time, Vince Miller had been infiltrating the branch for around 5 months. She states that she would have expected to have featured in reports from before May 1977 and to have been provided with a report in relation to the Duckett's Common demonstration. Ms. Poynter expresses surprise at the way that Vince Miller characterises the SWP in his report, which in her view suggests, open quotes, an underlying agenda in how he presents the Walthamstow branch, close quote. She has this reaction to claims made in the reports from 1977 about SWP meetings and talk of armed revolution. Open quote. The reporting is laughable, and I do not recognise it as remotely accurate or representative of what we were about. Our objective was to build a mass party by talking to people and getting on with daily organising. Close quote. Ms. Poynter notes in the report dated the 27th of January 1978 of an SWP district meeting that she is no longer listed with the reference, open quote, mentions SWP, close quote, but with a reference to her own special branch registry file. She states that there is nothing that she has seen in the reports that she has been provided with which would justify the creation of a personal file, and that she is angry that such detailed information on her personal life has been recorded. She comments upon further reports from September 1980, which record not only personal details, but also her future education plans. She states that there could be no good reason why this information was recorded and shared with the police and possibly the security services. In relation to another report containing personal information, she states, open quote, I find it disturbing that I was subject to such detailed profiling and investigation by Special Branch at the time. I was not someone engaged in subversion or who posed a public order risk, and I've never been arrested or convicted of any offence. I get the feeling that the reason that I'm being profiled in this way is simply for being active on left-wing issues, close quote. Other reports from this time record details about her then boyfriend, including his employment details and their domestic arrangements. And she states that this information was so personal that it feels deeply invasive to have been observed and recorded by the police. One particular report that her former boyfriend failed to obtain a job, in part because he was colourblind. This was not information known to her previously, which indicates just how deeply Phil had deceived her boyfriend into trusting him with intimate details about his life, and demonstrates how close they were as friends. Ms. Poynter states that she is surprised that there was such a focus of police resources on a small branch of the SWP in North London, whilst no undercover officers appear to have been sent into the National Front, at a time when National Front members were a source of serious violence and public disorder. Julia Poynter expresses concern that the details of a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old school children were recorded in intelligence reports simply for being attending SWP meetings and for being politically active. A report from July 1978 about the SWP district meeting refers to Vince Miller taking on leadership of the industrial group. Ms. Poynter observes that in taking this role, not only was Vince Miller reporting on the SWP, but he would be influencing its work and direction, which she views as, open quotes, obviously inappropriate, close quote. Julia Poynter also recalls that Vince was branch treasurer, a role that gave him access to the bank details of members and access to the membership lists. Members' bank details, including hers, were included in a report dated the 15th of August 1978, and she states, open quote, I am really shocked that the police recorded their bank details. I can't see any justification for this further serious invasion of their privacy and of their legitimate expectation of confidentiality. Close quote. She also comments on a report from April 1978, in which it is noted that it was intended to elect Vince Miller as the new treasurer at the following week's meeting, which indicates that he was aware of this, but did not take steps to avoid being elected. Her reaction to finding out that Vince and Phil were undercover officers. Her first reaction to learning that Vince and Phil were undercover officers was one of upset, and which later became anger. Anger at the betrayal of trust and friendship. This feeling was particularly acute in respect to Vince, who she considered to be a close friend. She finds it hurtful to think that she had trusted him enough to open up and share things with him over the 3 years of their friendship. Ms. Poynter is also very angry about Vince's decision to deceive Madeleine into a sexual relationship. And she is deeply concerned to learn that, notwithstanding a deceit of this nature, that he ended up in a position of power and authority as National Director of the NCIS. By way of conclusion, she states, overall, if the intrusion into people's personal lives and the resulting damage to them were not so serious, I would feel like the undercover police were a bit of a joke. I am astounded by the sheer volume of reporting and how trivial much of it was. I cannot see why such intrusive reporting was necessary. They spent years infiltrating a group because of its political ideology, rather than any realistic or practical threat of serious violence. Sir, that concludes the summary for Julia Poynter and the evidence for today.
Thank you very much. And that indeed concludes our proceedings for today. We will resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock when we will hear our first live evidence from Lindsay German. Thank you.